There's a common thread in my life, and it's about human capital. I'm originally from South Korea, and one of the things about South Korea is that if you know a little bit about the history, after we came out of World War II and the Korean War, we as a country were absolutely ruined. So the question is, fast forward half a century or so, how do we go from being the poorest, one of the poorest countries in the world, to a G20 nation? And keep in mind, we're only half of a country because we're divided between the north and the south. And we don't have natural resources. The answer is human capital. It was intentional and a concerted effort by the government to invest in the people. After I immigrated to the U.S., I mostly grew up in Silicon Valley. Now here's a question for you. Do you know why Silicon Valley is uniquely Silicon Valley? And why it's so hard to replicate Silicon Valley anywhere else, even though countries and cities have tried? It's about the efficient ecosystem of human capital that plays into everything from supply chain to knowledge-based value chain, economies and ventures. So yeah, you can say that I care just a little bit about human capital. I have 59 slides, and I know it's the end of the day, and if I could, I would keep you, but I'll try to stay within my 20 minutes slot. So what I'll do is I'll try and focus on the logical flow and mapping of the Vision 2030 and the NTP 2020 to show you how to begin to systematically create new industries to transform the kingdom and impact beyond GCC to the world. Now, since most of you are familiar with the framework for 2030, I'm not going to belabor it, but I'll just highlight a few key points that's relevant for my presentation. Then I'm going to talk about disruptions. I'm actually a global thought leader on the Internet of Things, so it plays beautifully from the previous panel. In particularly, there are technological disruptions that are affecting mankind. Never before. World Economic Forum calls it the fourth industrial revolution. Then I'm going to provide you with a high-level framework in terms of how do you turn the kingdom's vision for the future into comparative advantages for KSA that will leapfrog even the US and EU. As I learn more about the kingdom, and I'm just beginning to learn, I'm incredibly impressed, I have to tell you. It's a nation that's steeped in long history of innovation and progress. And it's not surprising at all to see the Vision 2030 plan coming out. If you look at the history, from the building of the country's infrastructure and modernizing the country in technology, education, healthcare, to agriculture in the 1930s to the 50s, to establishing the ministries of health, education, commerce, King Saul University in the 1950s to 60s, to the continual development and improvement of those infrastructures from the 60s to now. The Saudi kingdom has definitively emerged as a leading political and economic power. So with that context, it makes perfect sense when His Majesty aspirationally strive for the kingdom to become a pioneering and successful, not regional, but global model of excellence on all fronts. Wow. In just a single sentence, His Royal Highness, Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, underpins the uniqueness of Saudi Arabia that cannot be replicated by any other country in the world. It is the heart of Arab and the Islamic worlds. It is the investment powerhouse. And it just happens to connect Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now, these geopolitical and economic advantages are unrivaled. And this will become hugely critical as we look to develop new thriving industries to diversify the kingdom's GDP while increasing the human capital and opportunities for Saudi nationals. Now, that vision cascades down to the three major themes that succinctly balances the economy, the government, and its people. So what are some of the key objectives of the Vision 2030? Well, to rise from the current position of 25 to the top 10 countries on the Global Competitiveness Index. Wow. To increase digital investments and lead the digital economy. And to establish incredibly strong governance structure and mechanism. And to raise the non-oil GDP from 16% to 50%. I am so incredibly impressed in terms of the thought and the research, and I have met with some of the key leaders, and they have told me about how they made visits to South Korea, Ireland, Singapore, and other nations to identify key best practices. And you can tell that they have meticulously, in everything from governance model to achieving these goals, to the operating model of the National Transformation Program, to establish, to implement, and to measure those 2020 interim targets. This is definitively a unified national effort across every entity. Now, it's not without its challenges, but the government has done a tremendous job. What I love about this logical and progressive plan is that there are empirical, quantifiable metrics. Everyone knows what the targets are and the KPIs and how and what they're going to be measured against. And this level of transparency goes all the way down to the specific entity initiatives and even their allocated budgets. Moreover, all of these are constantly being monitored and audited. I was told that there's even a website you can go and see. Now, one thing that I want to tell you, and if you heard from earlier sessions today, is that the government cannot do this on its own. The government must and is already willing and very much collaborating with the private sector and the entrepreneurial community. Because government necessarily doesn't equate to innovation per se. The job of the government, however, is to provide the building blocks or the fundamental infrastructure to create platform effects. When I say platform effects, I'm talking about Uber. I'm talking about Airbnb, Android, and iOS. It's a platform effect that allows for entrepreneurs and private sector to leverage things like open data from the government, API services to that data and other things, to responsiveness of government, to spur innovation on a massive scale. Well, one thing I want to point out about this slide is, and I found this very interesting, is that there is a strong need to address the human capital and skill gap. And these initiatives from 2030 to the interim 2020 is very much focused on developing Saudi national talents and being less dependent upon outsourcing and offshore resources. And to raise that bar to help drive the kingdom to become a major human capital hub. Let me ask you a question. Did you know that in PwC's annual global CEO survey, 62% of CEOs expressed concern about the impact of disruption in their industry? Disruptions coming from all over. Internet of Things, AI, machine learning, data analytics, blockchain, decentralized computing, to changes in consumer behavior. Unless we as government, industry, and academic decision makers take action now, and which is happening, many companies and industries and economies are in danger of becoming irrelevant and obsolete. So really the choices are very clear. The World Economic Forum survey hints at when the future will have arrived. If you look at some of the lines here, the roles, it's when we have robotic pharmacists dispensing your medication. It's when our clothes are connected to the internet and smart and quantifying your biometrics. It's when AI is sitting on the board of directors. Mind-boggling. So what are some of these disruptive technologies? And you can see a short list up there. It's things like AI and machine learning. Now keep in mind, I have 59 slides, so I can't go into all the depth, but if you like, I'd be happy to talk to you about any one of these subjects in great detail. But it's already upon us. We're talking about Siri, Google Assistant, Alexa, IBM Watson, Alchemy API, X.AI, bots. And it's being applied to everything, in business to consumer interactions. It's the Internet of Things. And this will be probably one of the most promising trends for the kingdom, because there's an opportunity to leapfrog the rest of the world by making oil and gas, utilities, buildings, transportation, business to cities smarter and autonomous. Everything from water, agriculture, trains and cities and buildings and manufacturing to homes and cars are going to be IoT enabled. And we're going to reach this incredible ubiquity and density as inanimate objects come alive, communicate with each other, coordinate tasks and workflows, and provide us with real-time, predictive, and prescriptive data analytics for decision support. To robots in the workplace, home, public spaces, to self-driving cars and trucks. I travel the world, and people are so happy that they have a part-time job driving for Uber or Lyft. And I'm sad to tell them that their job is only going to be short-lived, because soon enough they will be out of job again when automation comes in. From centralized to decentralized, where, yes, cloud is fundamental. However, in addition to cloud, we are shifting to decentralized. And by definition, that's what IoT is about. And it's about pushing towards the on-the-edge fog computing, thanks to IoT. To quantum computing, which we'll focus on 2017, in terms of how it's going to revolutionize everything from security, transactions, to computation. To blockchain for immutable identity, authentication, and smart contracts. Excuse me, it looks like we've lost some connection on the slides, so we'll give them a few seconds to reconnect. All right, to our dependence on AI. That's going to empower personal ambient neural networks. You heard some mentions of deep learning and neural networks. It is fundamentally not statistics. It is allowing for the data itself to optimize the coefficient for that curvature. It is not about you as human beings defining the algorithms or the business rules. And more importantly, that neural network isn't going to just reside on the cloud level. It's going to reside on a device level. MIT has already done this with Iris. It's going to then work within a network to support your personal needs as individuals, much like Jarvis for Iron Man. One of the things that the Internet of Things world haven't actually started to discuss, and this is where we come in as futurists, is that it's not sufficient enough to collect data. It is not sufficient to analyze that data. But rather, where it becomes exciting is when you have an intermediary, which is the AI that works with the smart things and apps and systems to handle complex workflows and task coordination on your behalf. To human-computer interface that will shift from touch to gesture control, speech, and mind control. And I've demonstrated this on stage a few weeks ago. These disruptions cannot be stopped. It represents rapid and unstoppable evolution in the human innovation curve. And with the massive automation and intelligence, many of us, unfortunately, will lose our jobs. A net 7% of U.S. jobs are expected to disappear by 2025. Now, if you think these job losses are only for manufacturing and low-level manual tasks, you're wrong. Eventually, it's going to affect administration, sales and marketing, professionals, including ICT, and even executive management and board of directors. We are all at the risk of being disrupted. So the question is, are you ready for disruption? According to E&I, there's a high probability that 45% of companies in any given industry is going to become obsolete, just vanish. Let me pause for a second here. Do you know what the greatest risk and challenge is in companies and governments around the world? And it's not unique to the kingdom. It's this notion of allowing their personal fear of being disruptive to immobilize themselves, and therefore, instead of being proactive, they resist. They think that by resisting, they're saving their jobs. But in fact, they are sealing their fate. Collectively, this mindset that exists in organizations, this resistance to change, is going to lead to companies and industries slowly dying. Just look at the history of Fortune 500. 88% of companies on the 1955 list no longer is on the list of Fortune 500 today. Moreover, most blue chip companies only stay at the top on that list for about maybe 10 years before the new Google, Snapchat, and Uber take their place. So how can KSA, instead of being disrupted, become the disruptor? What you're seeing here is our framework for transforming industries and economies. It starts with futurism, and I'll explain in just a second. Then it gradually moves up to R&D, experimentation, and then the investment, implementation, and knowledge transfer. When I say futurism, what I'm talking about is this notion of envisioning the future. Now, this is vastly different from knowing the technology trends, because it's not good enough to say AI will disrupt. So therefore, we're going to apply artificial intelligence. That, in itself, is not a sufficient condition for guaranteeing the creation of a new, vibrant industry. See, envisioning the future requires special future-casting abilities to visually see how people are going to work and interact with one another in the future. And it requires an unbounded imagination and creativity and forecasting the world. And how do we begin to start to incrementally prepare for that? R&D. This is not about just R&D for the sake of R&D. Did you know that MIT Media Lab, for example, most of the work is done after the prototype and the white paper is published. And all that intellectual property just sits there on the shelf many times. What we're talking about is being able to translate that future casting to advanced research and IP patent development that's relevant for your kingdom. Let's take quantum computing as an example. See, it's not good enough to look at the white space in the patent landscape to figure out what you're going to do, but rather it requires being able to integrate the future envisioning with the advancement in quantum computing to determine the why, what, and the how things are going to be disruptive. For example, what if I told you that quantum computing can support instantaneous messaging and communication without the need for telco infrastructure? How could that potentially change your decisions today as you think about laying thousands and thousands upon kilometers of fiber optics? How could that change everything from telecommunication, broadband, Internet of Things to mobility? What will be the new user behavior in the world of telco where it's infrastructure-less, meaning without infrastructure? But it provides this real-time communication with absolutely zero latency. I don't know if you know, but countries and industries are in a race to develop intellectual property and patents. As of 2014, China ranks top with over 900,000 patent applications, followed by the US, Japan, and South Korea. You see, they know that in the future, their economies and the competitiveness depend on IP development. But it's not good enough to just futurecast and file patents. You have to prove out your hypotheses and technologies. It requires actually translating those deep insights and research into functioning systems and then validating those with the markets. Now, coming back to Saudi Arabia oil and gas industry, there is this massive opportunity to apply the kingdom's deep expertise in oil and gas into other industries. Do not apologize for knowing oil and gas so well, because that knowledge is hugely transferable to other industries. I'll give you a quick example. A sensor that uses thermal technologies to be able to understand the throughput of water or gas, as an example, or oil. And it's all done remotely, whether it's metal or PVC or other materials. You see, this is where we not only have to organically incubate innovation and technology, but we also have to look outside. We have to do formal investment and venture capital to appropriate the best-of-breed technologies that's emerging in the global startups. And it requires that disciplined investment approach in conjunction with internal R&D to broadly capture and apply those technologies here. Now, we then apply that R&D and portfolio startup technologies to new and existing industries to begin that transformation. It starts with new business model based on that innovation. Let me give you an example. One of our early forecasts was that many companies will transform from product companies to data companies. Some are going to choose to sell their products and add a SaaS or PaaS layer, right? But others, including, let's say, Whirlpool and many other companies like GE, let's say, may choose to actually not charge you a fee upfront, meaning that washer, disher, washer, dryer, refrigerator may be technically free. But rather, they're going to charge you on the utility based on usage and behavioral data captured from the Internet of Things. Now, just keep in mind, implementation is probably the hardest part of this methodology because it's about execution. How well you execute determines how successful these new industries will be in generating new GDP sources. Human capital is involved in every stage of that framework. But specifically, what I want to point out here in this phase is that it's about the knowledge transfer and skill development. You see, most implementations are oftentimes handled by offshore or outsourcing companies here, right? Well, they do the implementation, they do the maintenance, but that knowledge from that implementation rarely ever gets transferred to Saudi nationals. We want the local citizens involved in the entire implementation process, working alongside the expats and the subject matter experts from outside, including myself, to soak up the knowledge hands-on. For example, learning what it takes to deploy an Internet of Things implementation in oil and gas. Then taking that train-the-trainer approach and codifying it and creating formal training, content, and processes to be able to disseminate that information, that knowledge, among a broader set of Saudi locals. We want the goal to be the creation of new industries that are developing and supported by local citizens, not by outside people.